Ever heard that story about Target, like figuring out a teenager was pregnant before even her dad knew?
Yeah, it's pretty wild.
I know. Like Target's algorithms saw she was buying unscented lotion and certain vitamins, and boom, they knew.
Basically, her buying patterns changed just
It's
enough.
crazy, right? But it kind of makes you think, in this day and age, we leave digital trails everywhere.
Yeah, it's like we're constantly tracked.
So how do people still just, like, disappear? That's what we're going to be diving into today, like the whole world of missing persons. We've got some really cool uh, excerpts from a Vsauce video on this. And get this, we'll be talking about not just those who vanish, but also where people were declared dead when they weren't, or even buried with the wrong body parts.
It really is a paradox when you think about it. We're more connected than ever, but thousands still disappear each year. Poof, gone.
Yeah, you'd think with our phones and everything it'd be impossible.
You would, but think about it. Some crimes are never solved. So there's no trace of either the victim or the perp. And accidents, especially if they're out in the middle of nowhere, might mean a body's never found.
I see.
And then there's those who straight up want to disappear. Clean break, new life, the whole
Yeah,
shebang.
like they're running from something.
Oh, absolutely. Debts, legal trouble, or just their past in general.
Wow, so like their own witness protection program, but they set it up themselves.
Exactly. Of course, it's not exactly easy to just disappear these days. Ditch your phone, avoid banks, live totally off the grid. It's really hard.
Speaking of ditching your identity, there's a crazy story about the French astronomer, uh, what was his name? Guillaume Lejeune. He set sail for India way back in the 1760s, wanted to observe the transit of Venus, that super rare astronomical event.
Yeah.
But storms, wars, everything you can think of delayed him for 11 years.
11 years. Can you imagine?
By the time he got back to France, they declared him dead.
Oh, wow.
His wife had remarried, his stuff was gone. He'd even lost his fancy position at the Royal Academy of Sciences.
They thought he was a goner for sure.
11 years, man. It makes you wonder, what if we just dropped off the grid for that long? Would our online lives be enough to prove we were still around? Or would we be like digital ghosts?
It's definitely less likely today, but not impossible. Our digital trails are extensive, but they're not perfect. Lose your phone, never go online, only use cash. It'd be tough, but you could do it.
Okay, but what about those people who just disappear quietly? Not like they planned it, but they're just gone. And no one notices for weeks, months, even years.
Those cases are really unsettling. Like, remember Janet Veal? Her death went unnoticed for weeks, right there in her own apartment.
Oh, God.
And her cats, well, let's just say it wasn't a pretty sight when they found her. And then there's Joyce Carol Vincent. They found her dead on her sofa after 3 years.
3 years?
Yeah, TV was still on in a busy city, 3 years, and nobody realized she was gone.
That's kind of terrifying. How does that even happen?
It points to this thing researchers call missing. People who are never even reported missing to begin with. They're just statistically invisible. Yeah.
Missing. So who are these people? Like, can you give me some examples?
Well, think about it. Undocumented immigrants might be too scared to come forward. People estranged from their families, nobody's checking in on them. Even kids born to mothers experiencing homelessness might not have the official records to be found.
Right.
They exist on the margins, Their lives aren't as tied into the systems that keep track of us all.
It's crazy to think how many people could be out there missing, but no one even knows. It's like that stat, over 1 million missing kids in America. Way more than what's officially reported.
Exactly. It makes you think, we've got all this tech to track people, but so many still fall through the cracks. It challenges what we think we know about each other and how we take care of the most vulnerable people.
So we've got people disappearing on purpose, by accident, and just fading away unnoticed. But what about those times when someone's declared dead, but they're actually alive?
Ugh. Mistaken identities, premature obituaries. That's where things get really interesting. Take the Oklahoma City bombing, for instance. They found a severed leg that didn't match any of the victims.
Wait, so they buried someone with the wrong leg?
They did. They buried Lakeisha Levy with that leg. DNA tests later proved it wasn't even hers. And to this day, that leg is still unidentified, a nameless victim.
That's just chilling. And what about those premature obituaries? Like when the news has obituaries written up in advance for famous people, just in case they die?
Exactly. They got to be prepared to report the news fast, so they draft them ahead of time, leaving blanks for the date and cause of death, of course.
I guess that makes sense. But can you imagine reading your own obituary by mistake?
Well, it happened to Alfred Nobel, the guy who invented dynamite. He read his own obituary and it called him a merchant of death for profiting off weapons.
Yikes.
He was horrified. And you know what? That's actually what made him decide to create the Nobel Prize.
Really? To change his legacy?
Exactly. He wanted to be remembered for helping humanity, not for destruction. It really makes you think, right? If you saw your own obituary, would you want to change how people saw you? Or would you just be totally freaked out?
It's a good question. But not everyone gets that chance to fix things, do they? I think there was another guy, Marcus Garvey, supposedly died after reading a bad obituary about himself.
Yeah, although some people say that one's not totally true. Some say he had a stroke after reading the obituary, but it's hard to say for sure if it was the cause.
Still, it shows how much other people's opinions can affect us, you know? And
Yeah,
sometimes you just don't get to control the story they tell about you.
exactly. And that brings us to another unsettling possibility, living your life without even knowing who you really are.
Oh, wow. Now we're talking about some serious identity stuff. You mean like those baby swap situations?
Exactly. It's rare, but it does happen. Sometimes it comes out through DNA testing, like for paternity disputes. But get this. There was this incredible case in the Canary Islands.
Wait, tell me.
Okay, so this woman is out shopping, right? And an employee mistakes her for her best friend.
Yeah.
Turns out the employee actually knew her long-lost twin sister. They'd been separated at birth and had zero clue the other one existed.
No way. So this woman lived her whole life never knowing she had a twin.
Yeah, it's mind-blowing. It really shows how fragile our sense of self can be. Imagine finding out that your whole life, your family, your memories might be based on a total misunderstanding of who you are.
That is heavy.
It makes you rethink everything, right? Like all the assumptions we make about our lives and the people around us. Maybe nothing's as certain as we think it is?
Yeah. I mean, that's a lot to think about.
Definitely. So we've talked about how people vanish, but what happens after? Like who's actually out there looking for them?
Right. Like, what are the actual steps?
Well, first you've got law enforcement, obviously. They usually have special missing persons units.
Okay.
And then there's search and rescue teams, especially if we're talking about someone lost in the wilderness. They go out there, follow every little clue. It's a lot of work.
Makes sense.
And then, of course, there are the databases. Fingerprints, DNA, dental records, all that stuff gets cross-referenced to see if they can find a match.
Wow. So they're looking everywhere.
Oh, yeah. And you can't forget about the online communities these days. You've got all those amateur sleuths really digging into cold cases. Sometimes they find things the pros missed.
It sounds like a huge effort, especially with those missing cases where there's not even an initial report to go off of.
Yeah, it's like trying to find a ghost. No starting point, no last known location. It's tough.
And what about those folks who disappear on purpose? If they're actively trying to hide, how do you even begin to track them?
Those are tricky. It's not just finding someone lost. It's like trying to outsmart someone who's covering their tracks.
So what do they do?
Investigators might dig into financial records, look for weird spending, or if they suddenly stopped using their accounts. Sometimes they use surveillance, try to find fake names, or keep an eye on people they knew. In some cases, they even go undercover, you know?
Whoa, really?
Yeah, like blend into the missing person's new life. Piece by piece, figure out their moves and why they left.
That's intense, like something you'd see in a spy movie.
Ha! It's not quite as glamorous as the movies make it seem. These investigations can go on forever, years, even decades, and the families are just stuck, you know, waiting and not knowing.
I bet that's so hard.
It takes a huge toll on them. The grief, the not knowing, it just wears them down over time.
It must be like living with a constant open wound. Does the hope that they're still out there ever fade?
Hope's powerful. It can keep families going for a long time, even when things look impossible. But as time goes on, that hope mixes with despair. Every year brings more questions, more uncertainty.
It's so sad. But what about those cases where the person does come back? What's that like after so much time has passed?
Well, it's almost never a simple happy ending. Sure, there's that initial joy of seeing them again, but then comes a wave of all these complicated feelings. Families have to adjust, figure out why their loved one left, what they went through, and the person who is missing, they might be dealing with trauma, their own reasons for leaving, reasons that might be really hard to talk about.
So it's not just happily ever after.
Not usually. It's like trying to fix a broken vase. You can put the pieces back together, but those cracks are still there.
I see.
It really shows you how much our choices affect everyone, not just ourselves. And it brings us back to that question. If you could disappear, would you? Knowing how much it could hurt the people you leave behind.
Oof, that's a tough one. I think for most of us, those bonds are too strong to break.
I agree. We're social creatures after all, right? We need connection.
Totally. But it is interesting to think about.
It is. To imagine what parts of our lives we might want to leave behind, what new paths we might take if we had the chance.
Yeah, like a fresh start, a chance to change things, to imagine life without past mistakes holding you back.
Yeah.
But like we've seen, disappearing has its own problems too, right?
Exactly. It all comes back to how connected our lives really are. What we do affects others, whether we mean for it to or not.
So even though this is all about missing persons, it's about way more than that, isn't it? It's about identity, connections, choices, how we impact each other.
You got it. It's about vulnerability, about our ability to bounce back. It's about grappling with what we don't know and finding meaning even when we experience loss.
It's also a reminder that even though we want to understand everything, some things might always remain a mystery.
Right. And maybe that's part of what makes these stories so fascinating, right? The unknown keeps us curious, keeps us looking for answers, trying to make sense of it all. It's like that analogy we talked about before with the jokes. There's always more to discover, some hidden truth waiting to be found.
Okay, now you're getting philosophical on me again.
Well, what's a good deep dive without getting a little philosophical? It's what sets us apart, right? We can think critically, ask questions, imagine things beyond just the facts and figures.
You've got a point. But we've still got more to talk about. We've covered the mystery, the tragedies, what it all means. But there's one big piece missing. Oh, what is it?
The stories, the individual stories that bring these statistics to life. We have to remember that behind each missing person's case, there's a person with their own history, people who love them and are hurting a life that's been totally turned upside down.
You're right. It's easy to get lost in the numbers, the big picture. But these are stories about real people, people whose lives have been touched by mystery and loss.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And every story has something to teach us, something that makes us think, makes us feel.
So are you thinking what I'm thinking? Time to dive into some of these stories, give a voice to those who have vanished and those who are left behind still searching.
Absolutely. I'm ready when you are. What story do we start with?
All right, let's start with a case that everyone's been talking about for years, the disappearance of Maura Murray.
Yes, Maura Murray, a young nursing student who just vanished in New Hampshire back in 2004. They found her car abandoned after a fender bender, but no sign of her.
And that's one of those cases with tons of theories, right? Foul play, maybe she ran away on purpose, all sorts of things. There's been so much media coverage, online forums dissecting every detail. People are obsessed with figuring it out.
It's true. And even with all that attention, it's still unsolved. No hard evidence, no one's seen her for sure. Just a young woman gone without a trace. It really makes you think, even with all that technology, some mysteries just stay mysteries.
Yeah, and I think it shows the power of these stories, right? They capture our imagination, make us think, what if that were me? What if someone I love just disappeared?
It makes us think about our own vulnerability, that fear of the unknown. We go about our lives assuming things are predictable, that the people we care about will always be around. But these cases, they show us how fragile it all really is.
Yeah, it's a scary thought.
It is. And maybe that's why these stories stick with us so much. Because they tap into something deep inside us, a fear that's been around forever. The fear of losing someone, of not knowing what happened to them.
That makes sense.
It shows us that we're all connected, even if we don't always realize it. Our lives are all intertwined, and when one person disappears, a whole community can be shaken.
Okay, so we've got Maura Murray, a case that's become almost like a legend. But what about a case that shows us what happens to those missing people we talked about?
Well, there's the story of Asha Degree, a 9-year-old girl who walked out of her house in the middle of the night. This was back in 2000 in North Carolina.
9 years old. That's just, I can't even imagine a child that young just vanishing. Why would a kid leave their home in the middle of the night?
That's what everyone wants to know. Her family, the investigators, they've been searching for answers for years. And what makes it even sadder is that for a long time, there wasn't much to go on. Someone saw her walking along a highway in the pouring rain, and then poof, she was gone.
Just gone like that.
And her case didn't get a lot of attention at first. She was a young black girl from a rural area. It took years for her story to really reach a wider audience.
That's not right. It's like some people's disappearances matter more than others. It makes you wonder how many other kids like Asha are out there, and nobody's even talking about them.
You're right. It shows you how unfair things can be, even in cases as tragic as a missing child. But the good news is that lately, more people are paying attention to Asha's case. There have been some new leads, and people are working hard to find out what happened.
That's good to hear. It just shows you that you can't give up hope, even after all this time.
Right. Everyone who goes missing deserves to be remembered, no matter who they are.
I agree. And that's what we're doing here, right? Shining a light on these cases, showing how complex they are, remembering those whose lives have been changed forever. It's important work.
I think so too, because behind every statistic, every theory, every question without an answer, there's a human being whose life matters.
And that's what matters most. So where do we go from here? We've talked about the mystery, the sadness, the ethical stuff. But what does all this mean on a larger scale? What do missing persons cases tell us about ourselves, about society as a whole?
It's a great question. It's not just about individual cases, is it? It's about what these cases say about what it means to be human, the systems we've built, how we connect to each other, or sometimes fail to connect. It's a way to look at our values, what we prioritize, what we're afraid of, what we hope for.
Whoa, that's a lot to unpack. So, like, what are some of the bigger things we can learn from this?
Well, first up, I think it shows us how fragile life really is. We often feel safe, assuming that the people we care about will always be there. But these cases are a reminder that things can change in a flash. Nothing's guaranteed.
It's true. Makes you want to hold your loved ones a little tighter.
It does. And it also makes you think about the importance of community, of looking out for each other. Sometimes all it takes is one person to notice something's not right, to ask a question, to make a phone call. That could be all it takes to save someone.
It's like that missing idea again. People who are isolated, who don't have strong connections with others, they're more likely to disappear without anyone noticing.
Exactly. That's why it's so important to build strong communities, to reach out to those who might be struggling or lonely, to remember that we're all in this together.
Yeah, I like that. Especially in a world that feels so divided sometimes.
It's true. But these stories remind us that we're part of something bigger than ourselves. Our lives touch each other in ways we might not even see.
I think you're right. So what else? What other big ideas come to mind?
I think it also challenges how we think about identity and belonging. We often define ourselves by our jobs, our families, our place in the world. But what happens when all that's taken away? What happens when we disappear, literally, or even just metaphorically?
It's like that astronomer we talked about. He was gone for so long, everyone thought he was dead. When he came back, his whole life had moved on without him.
Exactly. It makes you ask those big questions. Who are we without our connections, without our past? What makes us us when everything we thought we knew is gone? It's something a lot of missing persons have to deal with, and it's something we as a society need to think about too.
Yeah, that's deep. And I think it also shows how powerful stories can be, right?
Yeah.
How we use them to understand the world, to deal with loss, to find meaning in the chaos. These stories about missing people aren't just mysteries to be solved. They're like reflections of what it means to be human.
You're right. Stories help us deal with trauma. They give us hope. They connect us to other people who've been through similar things. And when it comes to missing persons, these stories can help raise awareness, keep hope alive, and remind us that even in the face of terrible loss, the human spirit can endure.
That's a great way to put it. And I think that leads us perfectly into our next section. We've talked about the mystery, the sadness, the bigger picture. But now let's talk about the people at the heart of it all. Let's hear from the families who are left behind, who are trying to deal with this unimaginable pain and not knowing.
I think that's really important because behind every statistic, there are loved ones whose lives have been turned upside down. Parents who can't sleep because they don't know if their child is safe, siblings who grow up without a brother or sister, friends who are left with unanswered questions and a hole in their lives. Their stories are what this is really all about, and they deserve to be heard.
I couldn't agree more. So let's shift gears now and focus on the families, the loved ones, those who are left behind, to navigate this maze of loss and uncertainty. We've talked a lot about the mysteries surrounding missing people, the investigations, the search for answers. But it's easy to forget that behind every case, there's a whole world of pain and uncertainty for the families.
Absolutely. We can talk about these cases all day, but to really understand it, you have to imagine what it's like for the people who are actually living it. The parents who lie awake wondering if their child is okay, the siblings who grow up without a brother or sister, the friends who are left with nothing but questions. Their stories are really what this is all about.
And that pain never really goes away, right? Even if they get some answers, the scars are still there. The not knowing, the wondering, the guilt. It's got to be a heavy weight to carry.
You're right. The trauma of losing someone that way can last for years, even decades. It can show up as anxiety, depression, problems sleeping, even physical health issues. The constant stress, the endless wondering, what if? It takes a toll.
And there's often that guilt that eats away at families too, isn't there?
Yeah.
The thought that maybe if I had done something different, like they replay every conversation, every decision, looking for something that could have changed what happened.
It's a completely natural reaction. Families often blame themselves, even when there is absolutely nothing they could have done. It's a way of trying to make sense of something that feels totally random and unfair. They need a reason, a way to understand why this happened.
It's just heartbreaking. And then there's the media attention. It can be helpful, I guess, to raise awareness and maybe get some leads, but it can also be really intrusive and even harmful.
For sure, the media tends to focus on the most sensational parts of a case, and that can really twist how the public sees it. Sometimes it even gets in the way of the investigation. And for the families, it can feel like their loved one's story is being exploited, turned into entertainment. It's a tricky thing finding a balance between letting the public know what's going on and protecting the family's privacy and dignity.
And then there are those cases where the missing person actually comes back. But even then, it's not always the happy ending everyone hoped for. After all that time apart, all the things they've been through, the reasons they left it, can create a whole mess of emotions that are hard to sort out.
Reunions can be really complicated. Yeah, there's that initial joy of seeing them again, of course. But then the reality sets in. You realize how much has been lost, the time you can't get back, the relationships that have been damaged or broken. You can't just pretend everything's the same as it was.
And sometimes the person who is missing comes back, changed. They might have their own trauma, secrets, reasons for leaving that are hard for their family to understand. They might not be the same person they were before.
It's true. It's a lot to deal with. And it shows that there's no easy answer when it comes to these cases. Every situation is different, every family's experience is unique. But the one thing they all share is that deep sense of loss, that desperate need for answers, that hope that someday, somehow, they'll find peace.
It's a reminder that even when someone comes back, the healing takes time and it's complicated. There's often a need for therapy, for open and honest conversations, for everyone to be patient and understanding with each other. It's about rebuilding trust, redefining relationships, and finding a new kind of normal after everything that's happened.
You're right. It's a process.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I think it's really important to remember those families, to think about them, to offer them our support in any way we can. Their stories are a powerful reminder that behind all the statistics, all the mysteries, there are real people going through something truly awful.
I agree. It's easy to get caught up in all the theories and investigations, but we can't forget about the human cost of these disappearances. The families who are left behind, carrying the weight of their loved one's absence. They need our empathy, our support, and our commitment to finding answers and making sure justice is served.
And to all of you listening out there, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. It's been heavy stuff, but really important. We've explored the mystery of disappearance, from those digital trails we talked about to those invisible lives that just slip through the cracks. We've looked at the investigations, the mysteries, and most importantly, the human stories at the heart of it all.
And if this deep dive has made you curious, made you want to understand more, or made you want to help, we encourage you to keep digging. There are so many resources out there, organizations dedicated to supporting families of missing persons, stories that need to be heard.
Because in the end, it's through understanding, through compassion, and through action that we can actually make a difference. We can work towards a world where fewer people disappear,
Yeah.
where communities are stronger, where there's support for those who need it, and where those who are lost or looking for loved ones feel seen, heard, and supported.
Thank you all for joining us on this journey of exploration and reflection.
And to everyone listening, we urge you to remember the missing, to keep their stories alive, and to never give up hope.